The demon is a liar. He will like to confuse us, but he will also mix lies with the truth to attack us. The attack is psychological and powerful, so don't listen. Remember that. Do not listen.
That clip, of course, was taken from the 1973 supernatural horror film The Exorcist, which I regrettably watched around 5 or 6 years of age. As you can probably imagine, I didn't sleep well for a few nights after that experience. As a child, I used to imagine my bed moving by itself, and of course, growing up in California, the land of earthquakes, you can imagine exactly where my mind went at the first sign of a tremor. Today, the thought that a demonic entity could potentially inhabit your physical body and suppress your personality and your spirit, leaving you without any control of yourself, is truly terrifying. Depending on your religious background or your exposure to the Hollywood version of exorcism, I've often wondered how much of what we see in popular culture and cinema has taken creative liberties versus which aspects of these accounts actually happened. I reached out to our guest today in hopes to find some answers. Today's guest, here to discuss the historical elements of exorcism, bears some impressive credentials. Dr. Francis Young is a historian and editor, the author or translator of over a dozen books in the field of church history, folklore, cultural history, and the history of East Anglia. He obtained a degree in classics from the University of Wales, Lampeter, and a doctorate in history from Cambridge University. He is also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and was volumes editor for the Catholic Records Society between 2015 and 2017. For many years, he was head of sixth form at English Cathedral School, and he is now a freelance author and editor and a member of the Society for Editors and Proofreaders, as well as the secretary of the East Anglican Catholic History Society. So I want to welcome to the show Dr. Francis Young. What started you, I guess, getting into researching this kind of thing?
Well, I suppose my interest in exorcism specifically is something that comes from my academic background, which is studying the history of Catholicism. So really, I was looking at it from a church history perspective. My PhD was looking at the relationship really between supernatural beliefs and religion, with a particular focus on the 16th and 17th centuries in England, where, of course, Catholicism was a banned religion at that time after the Reformation. And one of the chapters was about exorcism, and I was shocked to find how little had been written on this subject in English, and particularly shocked to discover that there was no history of exorcism in English. There was one in German. That was the most thorough one I could find, and quite a few pieces of research in Italian, but nothing in English. So really, I suppose I was motivated by that to see whether I could remedy the deficiency.
And where are you located right now?
So I'm based in East Anglia, so that's the eastern side of England, close to Cambridge.
Okay. So I guess, at least from the United States perspective, I rarely travel outside of the United States, so my scope is very limited. But I feel like Hollywood kind of portrays a certain element of Catholicism as well as exorcisms that may or may not be true. I was hoping you could kind of outline some of the big differences and some of the similarities that I think that might be accurate historically.
Yeah, well, I must confess that I actually avoid watching exorcism movies, partly because it's something that I've studied for so long, and I just get frustrated and annoyed by all of the inaccuracies that you find there. Some people talk about that as a kind of a genre in its own right of cathsploitation movies, they're sometimes called. And of course, it all starts with The Exorcist, which is by no means a bad film. It's in many ways a very great film. But I think what we have to bear in mind with all of these films, first of all, they all derive from the template of The Exorcist. And that's a very particular kind of film with a very particular slant that it takes on exorcism. And I think also the second thing to bear in mind is that the kind of exorcism portrayed in The Exorcist is a type of exorcism that doesn't appear in the historical record really until the 16th and 17th centuries. And in many ways, it doesn't take its modern form until the 19th century. So you're actually looking at something quite modern there, and quite a modern idea of what an exorcism would be. And I think also that when you speak to practicing exorcists, as I have, although they're not at liberty to talk in specific detail about what they do, because that's part of the rules that govern exorcism in the Roman Catholic Church, they will say that the exorcist exaggerates, and other films derived from it exaggerate the dramatic potential for what happens during an exorcism. That it's generally not like that. In rare cases, they might accept that such phenomena they might claim to have witnessed, but it's generally speaking, it's something a lot less dramatic than that.
And how would you compare, to use your words, a pre-modern exorcism compared to the 18th century and after?
Well, I think in the pre-modern period, so from late antiquity, really, the 4th century AD, right the way through to the 16th century, so throughout the Middle Ages, exorcism is regarded as something quite normal, really. It's I suppose, a word which has been used to describe it is antiseptic. It's almost as though there are these unclean spirits that people believe in, which in some ways are quite similar to our view of bacteria or viruses. They're something which causes everyday problems, and that might be demonic possession, but it might also be a blight of the crops. It might be unexpected storms and weather events. And people will use exorcisms against all of this stuff, and there's nothing dramatic about it. There's nothing particularly involving a kind of cosmic struggle between good and evil. It's just another tool that you've got at your disposal to deal with unexplained events in your everyday life, and it's just part of the medieval world. And it's only really in the 16th century, as a result of the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation going against the Protestant Reformation, that people become very concerned about the possibility that the devil himself, so not just these unclean spirits, but Satan proper, is alive and active in the world and is causing trouble and is, if you like, causing the divisions amongst Christians. And therefore you get a much more a kind of a dramatic and quite literally dramatic, because it's very much like a theatrical performance, a view of exorcism that is all about proving the power of the priest and showing that the church has the authority to command the devil. But that's, very much a modern phenomenon.
So do you think there's actual merit to the actions they're performing, or is it more ritualistic in the sense of, this is just kind of like a drama, like you say?
There are various interpretations of what's really going on in an exorcism, and one of the interpretations is that it's a communicative, performative act. So in other words, there are cultural expectations which the demoniac, for want of a better word, the possessed person, is perhaps unconsciously aware of at some deep psychological level. So once they assume that role of being a demonically possessed person, there's a cultural script that person knows to follow. And as soon as the exorcist starts pronouncing certain words, then the possessed person will start behaving in a certain way. So that's one possible interpretation. Other people would put down possession phenomena entirely to an as yet undiagnosed form of mental illness. Now, I'm not an expert in psychiatry, and I think without being an expert, it's not really for me as a historian to make a judgment about that. I think that there's a danger in historical diagnosis, and I think you see in past historians that they've kind of made this mistake of sort of falling into a pitfall of trying to say, oh, well, everyone who was suffering from demonic possession was experiencing some kind of hysteria. Everyone was experiencing schizophrenia or was experiencing split personality disorder. And whenever we try and subject those kind of analyses to a modern reinterpretation, they always seem to fall short. So I'm not convinced that there's a lot of merit to trying to, if you like, reductively explain what happens in these situations. And my honest answer would be, I don't know. And in a way, it's not really my place to know. It's my place to look at the sources and to study particularly in my case, the way in which exorcists behaved and why.
So I think maybe my next question would be, historically speaking, have you found many accounts of, let's say, an exorcism taking place and then someone coming along to psychoanalyze the person affected? Do you ever find a conflict between the two in the research you've done?
Well, in terms of contemporary exorcisms, it's often the way that in Western countries, so in England, in France, in Germany, to some extent also in the United States, that many of the priests who are appointed as diocesan exorcists will actually be individuals who have a background as medical doctors and in some cases as psychiatrists. In fact, the individual instructions issued by bishops' conferences for many Western countries have that expectation that, if at all possible, the priest who is appointed should be a medical professional. And that, I think, gives them an interesting perspective. It means that they're almost looking at the phenomena along parallel tracks. They're analysing what's the psychological, psychiatric state of this person, but they're also looking at it from a spiritual perspective, which obviously they're obliged to do because of the authority that's been given to them as exorcists. I think in the majority world, in the developing world, it's very different, because there I think there's an acceptance of exorcism almost as there was in the medieval world in Europe, as a part of everyday life. So in Africa, in South America, exorcism would not be perceived as something unusual or strange. If you're looking at societies in which the involvement of spirits is something which is expected in everyday life, within non-Christian animistic religions, it really transfers across to the interpretations of Christianity that are adopted within those societies. And so exorcism is the norm, really, in many of those societies. So I think that these anxieties about medical diagnosis going in tandem with exorcism is something very Western. And of course, from the perspective of global Catholicism, it's therefore fairly insignificant, since the vast majority of Catholics now are in the developing world.
Well, I was not aware that they had such an extensive medical background prior to being assigned to that kind of a duty.
Many of them, yes. I mean, by no means all, but I think that is the preference. Certainly, that's the case in England, and I'm not as familiar with the situation in the US, but I have come across instances there of exorcists who are former doctors, certainly.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, I guess I think I'm approaching this interview as more of having a certain idea in my mind, and I should just go back to the beginning and I guess ask, what would be the historical definition of a modern age exorcism? What's the purpose? I know you kind of touched on that a little bit, but if you had to sum it up as a let's say Webster's dictionary version, what would you call that?
Yeah, well, I think that it depends whether we're talking about exorcism in the general sense or exorcism proper. So exorcism proper, in the true sense, would be the use of an authoritative command to drive an evil spirit out of possession of a human body. Mm-hmm. If we're talking about exorcism in a more general sense, the word has been used to mean the cleansing of haunted places, so haunted houses and things like that. And I think particularly in the US and in England as well, in the English-speaking world, this is a meaning of exorcism that has almost taken over as the main meaning of exorcism, this idea of cleansing haunted houses. And actually, that's a very, very recent idea. That's something which we don't see the first inklings of until the 16th century. We don't get it as a regular operation until the early 20th century. So that's something which I think is a recent development. Other things that might be called exorcisms, we have exorcisms of objects. So there are very ancient rites going all the way back to the 3rd century, which involve pronouncing exorcisms over water, salt, and oil in order to consecrate them for worship. We also have exorcism used for protections against evil. So some Catholics will refer to the medal of St. Benedict, which is a kind of amulet, as a form of exorcism. So the word can be used very, very widely. But I think if we're talking an exorcism proper and within the Roman Catholic tradition, that is kind of legally defined as a major exorcism, then an exorcism proper would have to be the use of authoritative words to command a demon, an evil spirit, to leave a human body.
So I guess maybe walk me through what, because I hear rumors, I hear stories, I listen to a lot of these podcasts myself, but again, I have no experience with this, but what kind of criteria might be used to evaluate whether or not an exorcism is necessary?
Well, again, the criteria in the Roman Catholic tradition are very specific, and they're actually laid down in canon. So the major criteria would be an attempt to distinguish somebody who is genuinely possessed from someone who is suffering some form of mental illness, whether or not that's been diagnosed or not. And therefore, these are supernatural signs that we wouldn't expect to see in a natural illness. And so those would include the ability to manifest unnatural strength beyond what that person would physically be capable of. It would include the ability to speak in strange languages that the person had no knowledge of. So somebody might start talking in Latin if they had no education in that language. And the ability to know things that are happening at a distance, but without any way to know that, which I suppose in the internet age is not quite as remarkable as it might have seemed when these rules were written down in the 17th century. But certainly, the idea of this kind of remote supernatural knowledge is something that would be expected. So those would be the main signs. And the other important one to mention is a horror and inability to remain in the presence of holy objects, holy images, and the inability to listen to holy names and words. So the name of Jesus, for example.
Now, are there, to your knowledge, different stages of possession? I recently had a theologian on my show, John Paul Capis, and he was kind of explaining that to me according to some of his research. But what kind of historical significance have you found, if any, of different types of stages or progressions of possession?
Oh yes, I mean there is an established demonology in this regard, which goes all the way back to the 13th century. And yes, I mean there's an idea first of all of something which might be called circumcision. So we hear a lot about possession, but actually possession is the last stage. Circumcision would be the idea of somebody having, let's say, bad dreams involving the demonic. It might mean that they start to feel spiritually oppressed, but nothing is happening, nothing paranormal is happening. And the next stage after that would be infestation. So that would be, things might start happening around your house. So you might start to experience, I suppose, things that we might associate with poltergeist phenomena. Or it might be an apparition of something demonic, which is tormenting you in your waking vision, if you like. And then after that, we get to a point called obsession. So obsession is actually from the Latin word obsideo, which is the word meaning besiege. So our modern use of the word obsession is actually quite different from this. This would be the idea that you literally feel besieged in your own body. So you're receiving constant pressure from a demonic agency to make you change your behavior. So it would be presumably a little bit like voices in your head telling you to do things, but you still have your free will available. You still have your human will, which is able, with difficulty, to resist if you choose these demonic suggestions. But it's almost as though the evil spirit is trying to take control of you at that point. And then the final stage would be possession. So that's when an evil spirit is fully in control of your body. Not necessarily all the time. I mean, the evidence suggests that in most cases, people who are possessed or claim to be possessed or think of themselves as possessed are it's not a permanent state. It's something which might happen particularly in the presence of the exorcist, in the presence of a holy object, in the presence of the rite of exorcism. And that's a sense in which the person loses their free will and their body, they lose their personality, it's taken over by another, and their body might manifest paranormal phenomena like levitation or something like that. That would be the final stage, and it's at that stage that the Roman Catholic Church would then be in a position to consider a major exorcism, that exorcism in the true sense.
So I wonder if there's a certain point where people who believe they're potentially being possessed realize that that's happening. Is it kind of early on, or is it later when they start having these nightmares or seeing apparitions or things? And I guess historically, when do they typically reach out for help?
I think it varies hugely. This is one of the things that interests me, is the extent to which people are aware of the services that the church provides. And I think that in a lot of cases, I mean, in the famous case of the boy known as R or Robbie, that was originally in Washington, D.C., that the case occurred, and this is the case that was the basis for the fictionalization in The Exorcist, the novel, and then the film. And in that case, you had the parents, first of all, going to a Lutheran pastor who didn't feel that he was able to provide any assistance, and then going to a number of different Catholic priests recommended by the bishop, some of whom were more skeptical than others. And I think that it can be quite a challenge for people to get an exorcism, because quite a lot of clergy are either skeptical of the reality, or they're very reluctant for political reasons to get involved, which is understandable, really. I mean, do you really want your name to be associated with an exorcism? Do you really want to get involved in something which might turn out to be a scandal if it turns out to be unfounded? And I think that it varies greatly, and people might approach secular practitioners. They might approach paranormal investigators before they approach the church. But often the trigger seems to be things happening around the home. So the most common stage, if I had to commit to an answer, would be that people seem to approach exorcists when they are experiencing infestation. So the paranormal phenomena around the home.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered the fact that some, I guess, clergy wouldn't want to be associated with that, in case, maybe it was later found out to be a hoax or something like that. Historically speaking, I know I'm gonna preface all my questions with that, but have you? I guess what have been some of the more, I guess, compelling stories that you've heard of?
Compelling in the sense that
just that maybe there was evidence to find that possession was truly taking place, and or other people, other clergy members or experts may have sort of backed up those results.
Well, I think the difficulty is that with accounts of exorcism, dealing with a very small accounts sometimes, which have only become available in the public domain because they were the subject of legal proceedings, or by and you can literally count those on the finger of one hand. Or you're dealing with accounts which are from a time when we just can't have the kind of certainty that we're dealing with a reliable account. So, accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries. That exorcisms always take place within the context of the cultural expectations of the time. And when you look at modern cases, a famous example would be the case of the boy R, which came to light as a result of an accident, really. And I think that, for good reason, that case has become the cornerstone, I suppose, of popular culture surrounding exorcism, because it is a very compelling case, and we've got the eyewitness statements of apparently reliable priests. And another notorious case is the Klingenberg case of 1976. So that's a case where a German young woman, Anneliese Michel, is exorcised and as a result dies. So that becomes the focus of a murder trial. I think the trouble is that in any exorcism situation, because of the structure of an exorcism, there are so many opportunities for collusion and for the exorcists to construct what they're doing and to convince themselves that what they're doing is right and that they are on the right lines. The trouble is, it's very rare that the person being exorcised, very rare that the demoniac is the one who gives the account of what happened. It's always the exorcist, in my experience, or almost always. So I would be very wary of committing to saying, oh, well, this is a particularly convincing case, because there's always another explanation. And as a historian, I have to be very aware of that.
So I've heard recent rumors that the Vatican has made an attempt to put an exorcist in every parish. From your knowledge, is there any truth to that rumor?
Well, certainly not in Europe. There is a policy which is an official policy of the Vatican, but as often in the case with the Vatican, official policy doesn't bear much relation to how it's actually played out on the ground in reality. And the official policy is that every diocese should have an exorcist. Now, I think in the US, you're closer really to achieving that than in Europe, because in Europe there is a much greater shortage of clergy than there is in the US, and in England that's just not realistic. It's not even remotely realistic. I think that what the bishops in England aim for is one bishop in every province. So in other words, where there's an archdiocese, there's an attempt to have an exorcist there who can then provide consultation to the diocese that are part of that or under the jurisdiction of that archbishop. So yes, I mean, that may be the intention. I think if you look at Italy, then you're more likely to find a proliferation of exorcists because you've got more resources there. You've got more interest in exorcism in Italy. Other countries are notoriously hostile to the idea of exorcism. So the church in Germany, the church in France, very hostile to it. In Germany, that goes back to the Klingenberg case, which kind of discredited exorcism in the eyes of many German bishops. And in France, it really just goes back to the fact that it's a deeply secular country, and therefore there's a worry on the part of the bishops that if they indulge in something like exorcism, it will scandalize the country at large. I think in the US, you're probably more accepting of the possibility of exorcism because I think it's a less secular country. And I think there's also in the US, there's a thriving market for secular exorcists and paranormal investigators. And so I think that the church really is sort of trying to fit into that market.
I think you're right. Have you run into any encounters of more of a secular or paranormal group successfully performing exorcism, whether it's of a house or location or person, individual?
Well, again, you'll find many claims. Whether those claims can be substantiated is a moot point. It's not something that I've investigated. I mean, my focus is very much on the official activities of the Catholic Church. But yeah, I mean, certainly I've come across in passing many claims that have been made. Often, though, those secular practitioners stay away from exorcism in the true original sense of dispossessing a human body. They seem to be focused mainly on haunted houses. And I think that there's probably a reason for that you don't want to get yourself kind of tied up in an assault case or something. You know, if somebody accuses you of doing something improper during an exorcism or an exorcism goes wrong of a human being. Whereas, you know, you can ply your trade claiming to exorcise haunted houses with minimal kind of repercussions of that nature.
Mm. Well, tell me if I'm crossing a line here, but what do you personally believe? Do you think that there are legitimate, demonic activities happening where they're possessing people and or places that have a need to be exorcised?
I think the wise response to give is that I don't know. So I would have to say that I'm an agnostic. I think that to reject out of hand the possibility that demonic forces beyond our understanding exist is impossible. I mean, we can't rule it out because we don't have any way to rule it out. And we have this historical record which contains lots of people's personal experiences and claims to have experienced this kind of thing. But then on the other hand, to positively assert, well, this is real. There are almost always other possible interpretations, and even when there aren't other possible interpretations, there's usually the possibility of fabrication or exaggeration and so forth. I mean, the answer has to be I don't know. I think as a historian, that's not really the question that I'm concerned with. I'm not really interested in definitively answering, is this real? I think if that were the question I were interested in, then I would try and get in on the action. I would try and find out what exorcists are actually doing. Whereas I'm more interested, I suppose, in the process. I'm more interested in how the church sees this activity, how culturally it's perceived, and how it's developed historically. I realise it's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's the truth. I just don't know.
Well, I appreciate that, though. I mean, you, on one hand, it's even if you witness all this stuff firsthand, there's no way to scientifically explain it. But at the same time, you can't deny that something's happening, beyond the normal laws of physics.
Yes, and I think that we shouldn't be afraid of saying that things are unexplained. But I think that the mistake that many people make is to assume that when something is unexplained, it's therefore paranormal. And that doesn't follow. That's a logical fallacy. The fact that it's unexplained just means that we haven't found an explanation for that. That explanation might be a purely naturalistic one. It might be a psychological one, or it might be a paranormal one. And I certainly wouldn't rule that out completely. But I think that we should always look for the natural explanation first.
So knowing that your goal is not necessarily to prove or disprove, would you, given the opportunity, be involved or witness an exorcism?
I would certainly hesitate to do that. Curiosity would probably overcome my hesitation. But yes, I suppose I would. The opportunity's never really presented itself. But I suppose, yes, I would, but I think I would go in with a certain amount of healthy skepticism.
So kind of looking back at, I guess, popular culture today, I think there's a big belief that the Vatican is hiding a lot of information. And the motives are, they range from either just, concealment or they're trying to protect the public from some information that's going to do a lot of people in. I don't know, there's probably a number of theories out there, but do you believe they're hiding anything from the public?
Well, the Vatican is notoriously secretive, and they're undoubtedly hiding many things from the public. Whether those things are associated with exorcism and the threat from demonic interference, I'd be more dubious about. I think that it's important to bear in mind that something like exorcism is, although the rules are made by the Vatican, the Catholic Church it's not like a multinational corporation. It delegates a lot of its functions to individual bishops' conferences of countries and also to individual bishops. And actually exorcism is one of those things which falls under the jurisdiction of individual bishops. And they have quite a lot of latitude to make whatever decisions they want, including deciding that there aren't going to be any exorcisms in their diocese. That's within the authority of a bishop to decide that. And so I would take with a pinch of salt any claims that the Vatican is hiding something. The Vatican, until recently, had its own exorcist, who was quite well known, Father Gabriele Amorth, who died recently. And but I think people often exaggerated his importance in that he was the Vatican's principal advisor on the matter of exorcism, but his actual status was he was just the exorcist of one diocese, which happened to be the Diocese of Rome, the most important in the world. But nevertheless, he didn't have any authority that extended beyond that. So I think, yes, it's something which it's not exorcism is not a high priority for the Vatican, and we know that because it was the last rite to have an official version revised after the Second Vatican Council. So the council ended in the 1960s, but it wasn't until 1999, 30 years later, that we actually get a rite of exorcism. And it's even more recently that in the last 2 years, that rite has actually been translated for the first time into English, meaning that many clergy weren't willing to use it while it was still only in Latin. People often exaggerate the priority that the Vatican gives to exorcism.
So if myself or anyone listening wants to get involved in researching the history of exorcisms, are there any particular resources you would recommend or processes to follow?
At the risk of sounding mercenary, I would recommend my book, which at the moment is the only book in English on the subject of the history of exorcism, which is called A History of Exorcism in Catholic Christianity, published by Palgrave Macmillan. So that's one place to start. There are some accessible accounts by journalists. So there's Matt Baglio's The Rite is perhaps the best known one, which is an attempt to follow a priest going through the process of training to be an exorcist. I would take that book with a pinch of salt, but it does make an attempt to give an accurate account. There are other books. There's a book which is about the facts as they are known, lying behind the story of the exorcist. There are books about the Klingenberg case, about the case of Anneliese Michel, because all of the documents there are accessible because it was a criminal case. Another good book to give an overview of the idea of possession and exorcism is by Brian Levac, called The Devil Within. There are some reliable sources online, but there's also a lot of unreliable stuff out there. Gabriele Amorth's first book, An Exorcist Tells His Story, is also a good starting point for understanding modern exorcism.
Well, I think, I hate to be one of those guys that says, hey, I saw that movie, but you mentioned The book The Rite, and
yes.
Hollywood did produce a movie. I don't remember what year it was out, but I recently watched it, and I believe it had Anthony Hopkins. I have not read the book, but I don't know how much liberty was taken creatively by Hollywood, for the story in the movie. But if it's anything like the book, my God, that's terrifying.
I've not actually seen the movie, so I can't speak to that. I got the impression, certainly from what I heard about the movie, that it was a much exaggerated version of what was in the book, which is what Hollywood does every time, really. But the book itself, I think, is also rather sensationalized. But it does, it is based on some level of truth. There are training courses run by the Vatican, which train exorcists from around the world. So that is a real process. It does really exist.
So I guess as a researcher, how would you begin to attempt to scrutinize something from being fact-based versus something sensational?
I think always ask yourself the question, who actually is reporting this, and if it's it may be a personal first-hand account from somebody who performed the exorcism, in which case it's interesting from the point of view of that's how the exorcist perceives what he did, but you have to bear in mind that's only one side of the story. Or it may well be that it's a third-hand account, second-hand account of what happened, somebody who witnessed it or somebody who didn't even witness it witness it, but is kind of imagining what happened. And I think a lot of the time that happens too. And as I mentioned, it's very rare that you get all of the documents involved in the case released. The Catholic Church is very secretive about what happens in exorcisms, and to some extent that's understandable because, rather like intrusive medical procedures, these are events that people have a right to expect that they be kept very highly confidential. It's rather like what happens in the confessional. On the other hand, records are kept, so all dioceses where an exorcism has been performed, there should be records. But those records are never, as far as I'm aware, released to the general public, except where there is a criminal element and the state compels the church to release those documents. So it is quite a challenging thing to research exorcism for that reason, especially modern exorcism. Effectively you're dealing with a tiny number of documents available in the public domain. I've also spoken to practicing exorcists, but they again will make very clear from the outset that they can't talk even in anonymized terms. They can't talk about individual cases. They're not supposed to do that. What they can do is they can talk about the process of how exorcisms are authorized. They can talk about the nature of the training that they've received. It's quite difficult because of the quite severe canonical restrictions that are placed on any information about exorcism.
It's very fascinating stuff, and I think worthy of anybody looking into and getting information if they can. I know I kind of ran late with our getting started here, and I really want to be respectful of your time. Where can people go to learn more about you and find your book?
Well, I have a blog, which is francisyoung.wordpress.com, or you can go to the Paul Grove Macmillan website where you can find the book, and you can also follow me on Twitter. My handle is @SuffolkRecusant.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll put all those in my show notes for anybody interested in following up. And thank you so much for your time today. And again, I apologize for being late, but it was a pleasure having you on, and I did learn a lot.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be part of the show.
I want to send a huge thank you out to Dr. Young for taking the time out of his schedule for this discussion. I don't know about you guys who are listening, but I find it easier to watch some of these movies that come out knowing that a lot of the stories are highly exaggerated. However, there are still some very terrifying elements with some significant historical backing that I would rather not experience firsthand for myself. I've placed the links to Dr. Young's blog, his book, A History of Exorcism in Catholic Christianity, and his Twitter profile in the show notes at deviatus.com. Next week, I will be concluding Season 2 of the show. I'm going to be making good on a promise that I made way back in Season 1, and I'll be sharing some information about the show's future. As always, I would love it if you could rate, review, and subscribe to the show in your favorite podcatcher. You'll find me on Twitter and Instagram at DeviatusPod, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you all have a great week, and thank you so much for listening.